This comes after Trump imposed 15% tariffs on most EU products, with negotiations open for certain sectors, including steel and aluminium, which carry 50% tariffs. Merz has described the agreement as painful for the entire European industry, but said that the EU was not in a position to trigger a full-blown trade dispute. Let's take a closer look at what he had to say.
Sondern es finden jetzt noch Gespräche statt, um zum Beispiel bei Stahl und Aluminium entsprechende Quoten auszuverhandeln, die nicht ausverhandelt worden sind am letzten Wochenende. Dass diese Vereinbarungen nicht heute am 1. August, sondern erst am 7. August in Kraft treten, war immer schon von der amerikanischen Seite aus in Aussicht gestellt worden, weil sie wohl auch in den Zollbehörden in Amerika nicht innerhalb von 3 oder 4 Tagen plötzlich andere Zollsätze durchsetzen können. Aber ich gehe davon aus, dass der 7. August dann wirklich das letzte Datum ist, wo diese Vereinbarungen in Kraft treten. Alles andere wäre inakzeptabel. Dieser Abschluss ist schmerzhaft. Nicht nur was die Stahlindustrie betrifft, sondern was die gesamte europäische Industrie betrifft, zeigt aber auch, in welcher Verhandlungsposition wir waren. Und ich will alle denen vehement widersprechen, die jetzt glauben, im Nachhinein erklären zu können, was man alles hätte besser machen können. Wir waren nicht in einer Verhandlungsposition, um einen handfesten Handelsstreit vom Zaun zu brechen. Da hätte es nur Verlierer gegeben, und der größte Verlierer wären wahrscheinlich wir, die Europäer, gewesen. Deswegen geht es jetzt darum, das auszuverhandeln, und ich hoffe sehr, dass wir da zu vernünftigen Vereinbarungen kommen, die auch der europäischen, auch der deutschen Stahlindustrie hinreichend genügende Exportmöglichkeiten eröffnen.
Well, a lot of points for us to cover there, and joining us to do so is Jayjit Bhattacharya, an economist and finance expert. Thank you ever so much, as always, Jayjit Bhattacharya, for your time. Let's first look at the situation surrounding India. Trump saying that he's heard that India won't be buying any more Russian oil. Of course, those secondary sanctions on countries purchasing Russian oil is a big point that's focusing on countries like China and India, amongst others. Also, the significance of this 25% rate now being imposed on India. Are the tariffs and the sanctions that could come from purchasing Russian oil all grouped into one in your mind, or are they separate things that will be dealt with separately by top officials from both countries?
Yeah, there isn't any official remark from the Indian government, and I think as any other responsible government, the Indian government is patiently looking at the overall situation and responding accordingly. Clearly, there seems to be pressure from the US government to adhere to a unilateral sanction from the US government on buying from Russia and buying oil specifically. If India, which is one of the largest consumers of energy in the world, moves away from Russian oil and starts procuring oil from other sources to which India has got access to, it will basically lead to a significant spurt in global oil prices, and it will therefore have a considerable dampening effect on the overall growth of the global economy, as the cost of energy will clearly go up. It will also obviously hurt India, and it will also hurt the US economy. So it's a bit of an inexplicable step taken forward, because Europe continues to buy in large amounts of all kinds of things, including energy, from Russia, and so does America, where America's imports of uranium went up by 43% in the last year. And uranium is again nothing but energy in a different form. So therefore, trying to arm twist India into not buying Russian oil, it does not make sense, because it does not add up to the overall purchasing that's happening by the West from Russia, and it ends up hurting both the American economy as well as the global economy.
Yes, and let's now shift our attention to the comments that were made by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Of course, the EU has agreed to a deal, but there are sanctions on specific goods, and the German Chancellor signalling that conversations around steel quotas will be had. What's the significance of this move? Of course, the EU, a large producer of that sector, and how could it see EU-US relations moving forward?
As we all know, EU already struck a deal with the US. It was one of the first economic blocs which struck a deal. But there is a widespread view that that deal is not good for Europe. In fact, it's detrimental for Europe. The deal essentially largely says that the US has got free access to the European market. It's zero tariff access, whereas EU has to pay a significant tariff, 15% plus, for accessing the US market. Now that would be a death knell for the steel industry, and Germany has a very large steel industry, and therefore in that context it is important to relook at how US and EU will be doing trade in steel, and that's really the context of this discussion that has opened up again.
Yes, and Jajit Bhattacharya, before we do let you go, let's look at now the trade situation moving forward. Of course, Trump's deadline of August the 1st has now finished. Rates on dozens of countries have now come into force, many at a lower percentage, but around a dozen at a higher percentage. We're still waiting, of course, on a deal with China. That extension of that ceasefire has yet to be agreed. Where does this go now? Is this set, and do you think that these tariff rates on nations will stay the same and that imbalance will disappear from the US perspective, or do you think this is a situation and an issue that will continue to be discussed and delegations will continue to try and find deals past this self-imposed US deadline?
See, for one, there are finer points to the tariffs that has been put in, as we all know now that there is significant exemptions of these tariffs. For example, electronics, pharmaceuticals, even minerals like barytes. There is zero duty on barytes imports into the US because that's critical for drilling and drilling, and therefore for energy security. So from a US perspective, they have kind of shielded themselves in critical sectors. Having said that, the rest of the world will also take time to actually come out with a deal so that they avoid the trap that countries like Vietnam and EU have fallen into, wherein they have signed up an agreement which they have to adhere to for the forthcoming years to come, and they can't change that. And that deal is not good for them. And also what will happen is that any further agreement that, let's say, an EU gets into with other nations, what they have given to US becomes the benchmark for any new trade agreement that these regions get into. That is very challenging for these regions, and therefore the other countries who have not had a deal with US will be quite circumspect. They will be looking at the possibility of living without US for the time being, rather than getting into a deal which they've signed off for the next few decades, and that's going to come back and bite them. So it's better to wait for a few years, if need be, than to get into a deal which is really going to harm their agricultural sector, their food security, and so on and so forth. And so I don't see many of these countries actually changing track. But having said that, will US again back off? Well, given by the past records, they have been doing that on a continuous basis. So they will see how badly they're getting hit. Their stock markets have taken a dive. And perhaps, in my view, they will again reconsider the tariffs that they have put in.
Jajit Bhattacharya, as always, thank you ever so much for your insight there.